I'm 93 years old. I have lived for nearly a century, without ever saying two simple words that could have saved every relationship I destroyed, every friendship I lost, every moment of love I crushed under the weight of my own pride. Two words that my mouth refused to form, that my ego would not allow. I'm sorry. My name is Arthur, and I need to tell you something that took me 93 years to understand. Being right is not more important than being loved. Protecting your pride is not worth destroying your connections to every person who ever cared about you. I spent 9 decades choosing to be right instead of choosing to be close, and I died alone because I could never admit I was wrong. You think apologizing makes you weak. You think admitting mistakes diminishes your authority, your intelligence, your worth as a person. You think that saying "I'm sorry" means giving up power, surrendering control, accepting defeat. That's what I thought for 93 years. That's the lie that cost me my wife, my children, my friends, and any chance at the kind of love that comes from being vulnerable enough to admit your failures. I learned early that men don't apologize. My father never said he was sorry, not to my mother when he came home drunk, not to us children when he lost his temper, not to anyone for anything ever. He taught me that apologies were for the weak, that admitting error was admitting inferiority, that real men stood by their actions no matter what the consequences. When I was 12 years old, I broke my mother's favorite vase while playing ball in the house. It was an accident, but when she found it shattered on the floor, I lied. I blamed it on the cat. I watched my mother cry over that broken vase, knowing I had caused her pain, knowing I could ease that pain with 3 simple words. But I couldn't do it. The words "I'm sorry" stuck in my throat like glass, and instead, I doubled down on my lie, insisting the cat had knocked it over, watching her grieve for something I had destroyed. The first hard truth I learned too late. When you cannot apologize for small mistakes, you train yourself to never apologize for big ones. When you choose pride over honesty in small moments, you build a character that will choose pride over love in the moments that matter most. I married Helen in 1952. She was kind, patient, forgiving, everything I was not. For the first few years of our marriage, she would try to resolve our arguments by looking for compromise, by acknowledging her own mistakes, by creating space for both of us to be partially right. But I never met her halfway. I never admitted fault. I never said I was sorry, even when I knew I was wrong, even when I could see the hurt in her eyes, even when my stubbornness was driving a wedge between us that grew wider with every unacknowledged mistake. When we argued about money, and I had clearly overspent on something unnecessary, I found ways to justify the expense instead of admitting I had been careless. When we argued about my drinking and I had obviously had too much, I insisted I was fine instead of acknowledging I had a problem. When we argued about my treatment of her friends and I had clearly been rude, I criticized her friends instead of admitting I had been inappropriate. Helen would stand there after these arguments, waiting for something, hoping for something, and I knew what she wanted. She wanted me to say I was sorry. She wanted me to admit that I had made mistakes, that I had hurt her, that I was capable of being wrong. But those words never came. Instead, I would act like nothing had happened, expect her to move on, treat our marriage like a courtroom where one person had to win and one person had to lose, and I was determined never to lose. The second hard truth: when you cannot apologize to the person you love most, you teach them that your ego is more important than their feelings. When you refuse to admit mistakes in your marriage, you turn your spouse into an adversary instead of a partner. When you choose being right over being close, you slowly kill the intimacy that makes love possible. We had 3 children. David was born in 1954, Margaret in 1956, Thomas in 1959. I loved those children more than life itself, but I could not show them love through vulnerability, through admitting my mistakes, through modeling the humility that healthy relationships require. Instead, I showed them love through authority, through being right, through never backing down, never admitting error, never showing weakness. When I lost my temper with David for spilling juice and I yelled at him unfairly, I never apologized. I justified my anger. I taught him that fathers don't say sorry to their children. When I missed Margaret's school play because I was working late, I never apologized. I explained why work was important. I taught her that her feelings mattered less than my priorities. When I promised Thomas I would teach him to play baseball, and then forgot repeatedly, I never apologized. I made new promises I wouldn't keep. I taught him that a man's word meant nothing. The third hard truth: children learn how to handle mistakes by watching their parents handle mistakes. If you never apologize to your children, you teach them that love does not include accountability. If you never admit you are wrong, you teach them that relationships cannot include honesty about failure. If you never show vulnerability, you teach them that closeness requires pretending to be perfect. By the time my children were teenagers, they had learned not to expect apologies from their father. They had learned to accept my mistakes without acknowledgement, my hurtful words without recognition, my broken promises without apology. They had learned that loving me meant accepting that I would never take responsibility for the ways I failed them. David stopped sharing his problems with me because he had learned that I would find ways to blame him for his difficulties instead of acknowledging the ways I had contributed to them. Margaret stopped expecting me to prioritize her needs because she had learned that I would justify my choices instead of apologizing for my neglect. Thomas stopped believing my promises because he had learned that I would make excuses instead of admitting I had let him down. My children grew up thinking that this was how families worked, that fathers were incapable of apology, that love meant accepting hurt without acknowledgement. They carried this lesson into their own relationships, their own marriages, their own parenting. I had not only failed to apologize to them, I had taught them that apologies were unnecessary, that relationships could survive without accountability, that love did not require taking responsibility for harm. The fourth hard truth: when you cannot apologize, you do not just damage your own relationships, you damage your children's ability to have healthy relationships. When you teach children that love does not include accountability, you send them into the world incapable of the vulnerability that intimacy requires. At work, I was known as someone who never backed down, never admitted error, never took blame for anything that went wrong. When projects failed, I found other people to blame. When clients complained, I criticized the clients. When colleagues pointed out my mistakes, I found fault with their performance instead of acknowledging my own failures. My inability to apologize made me impossible to work with. I was passed over for promotions repeatedly, because leadership requires the ability to admit mistakes, to take responsibility, to apologize when things go wrong. But I saw every missed promotion as evidence that I worked with incompetent people. I blamed politics, favoritism, anything except my own inability to take responsibility for failure. I spent 40 years working for the same company and never understood why I remained in the same position. The fifth hard truth: you cannot lead people if you cannot apologize to people. You cannot build trust if you cannot admit mistakes. You cannot create healthy working relationships if you cannot take responsibility for your failures. Leadership requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires the ability to say, "I was wrong." Helen tried for 35 years to create a marriage where we could both admit mistakes, where we could both take responsibility, where apologies were possible and forgiveness was freely given. She modeled the behavior she wanted to see, apologizing when she was wrong, taking responsibility for her mistakes, showing me how beautiful relationships could be when both people were willing to be vulnerable. But I never learned. I never softened. I never allowed myself the humility that love requires. Every argument became a battle I had to win. Every disagreement became a competition where one person was right and one person was wrong, and I was determined never to be wrong. In 1987, after 35 years of marriage, Helen finally stopped waiting for me to apologize. She stopped hoping I would change. She stopped believing that love could survive without accountability. She told me that she was tired of being married to someone who could never admit fault, never take responsibility, never acknowledge the ways he hurt the person he claimed to love. Helen didn't ask me to apologize. She had given up expecting that years earlier. She simply told me that she could not continue to live with someone who was incapable of the vulnerability that marriage requires. She said she felt like she was married to a stranger who looked like her husband but could not access the basic human capacity for acknowledging error. The sixth hard truth: when you cannot apologize, you become impossible to live with. When you refuse to admit mistakes, you force other people to carry all the responsibility for relationship problems. When you will not take accountability, you teach people that loving you means accepting hurt without acknowledgement, and eventually, they stop being willing to accept that trade. Helen moved out in September 1987. The divorce was finalized in 1988. She took half of everything and all of the warmth that had ever existed in our house. For the first time in 35 years, I was alone with my pride, my stubbornness, my absolute refusal to admit I had ever been wrong about anything. Sitting in that empty house, I finally had to confront what my inability to apologize had cost me. My wife was gone because I could never say I was sorry. My children called dutifully but rarely visited because they had learned not to expect acknowledgement for the ways I had failed them. My coworkers avoided me because they had learned that working with me meant accepting blame for problems I created. I had chosen being right over being loved, and I was right about everything and loved by no one. The seventh hard truth: being right is not worth being alone. Winning arguments is not worth losing relationships. Protecting your pride is not worth destroying your connections to everyone who ever cared about you. You can be completely correct about everything, and completely isolated from everyone. My children tried to maintain relationships with both parents after the divorce, but it was awkward and strained. They had grown up in a house where their father never apologized, never admitted fault, never took responsibility for anything that went wrong. They had learned to love me despite my inability to acknowledge my failures, but they had also learned that loving me meant accepting emotional distance, accepting hurt, without recognition. David told me once, during one of our careful, surface-level phone calls, that he had learned in therapy that he had never heard his father apologize for anything. Ever. He said he realized he had spent his entire childhood waiting for me to acknowledge my mistakes, to take responsibility for my failures, to show him that fathers were capable of the vulnerability that healthy relationships require. Margaret told me that she had chosen her husband partly because he was the first man she had met who could apologize when he made mistakes, who could take responsibility for his failures, who could access the humility that love requires. She said living with her father had taught her what she didn't want in a marriage: someone who could never admit fault, never acknowledge error, never say he was sorry. Thomas said he had spent years learning to apologize to his own children because he did not want to repeat the pattern he had learned from me. He said watching me refuse to take responsibility for my mistakes had taught him that fatherhood required the ability to be vulnerable, to admit error, to model accountability for the next generation. The eighth hard truth: your children learn how to love by watching how you love. If you cannot apologize, you teach them that love does not include accountability. If you cannot admit mistakes, you teach them that relationships cannot include honesty about failure. If you cannot show vulnerability, you teach them that intimacy is impossible. At 89 years old, I finally decided to try something I had never tried in my entire life: admitting I was wrong and saying I was sorry. It was the hardest thing I had ever attempted. My entire identity was built around being right, around never backing down, around never admitting fault. Learning to apologize felt like learning to breathe underwater, like trying to speak a language I had never heard. I started with small things. When I made mistakes at the grocery store or was rude to service workers, I forced myself to say, "I'm sorry." The words felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking with a heavy accent, like wearing clothes that didn't fit. But I practiced. I apologized for small errors, minor inconveniences, tiny failures. I was learning to use muscles that had atrophied from 9 decades of disuse. Then I tried to apologize to the people who mattered. I called Helen, who was living across town, and tried to tell her I was sorry for 35 years of refusing to take responsibility for my mistakes. But Helen was polite and distant. She thanked me for calling but did not seem moved by my apology. Too much damage had been done. Too many years had passed. Too many opportunities for accountability had been missed. I called my children and tried to apologize for failing them as a father, for never acknowledging my mistakes, for teaching them that love did not include vulnerability. They were kind, but careful. They appreciated my effort, but could not immediately trust this change. They had spent their entire lives learning not to expect apologies from their father, and one phone call could not undo decades of disappointment. The ninth hard truth. You can learn to apologize at any age, but you cannot undo the years when you refuse to apologize. You can take responsibility for your failures, but you cannot erase the impact of years when you refuse to take responsibility. People can appreciate your effort to change, but they cannot forget the decades when you were unwilling to change. I see my neighbor across the street, a man about my age who has frequent visits from his adult children and grandchildren. I watch them hug him when they arrive, laugh with him over dinner, include him in their celebrations and their ordinary moments. He has something I never learned to build: relationships based on mutual accountability, on the ability to admit mistakes, on the willingness to say, "I'm sorry," when sorry is what the situation requires. I realize that this man is not perfect. He makes mistakes just like I made mistakes. But the difference is that he can acknowledge his mistakes, take responsibility for his failures, apologize when he hurts people he loves. I'm 93 years old now. I have maybe 2 years left, maybe less. And I am spending these final years learning to apologize to a world that has largely stopped listening. I say, "I'm sorry," to cashiers and waiters, to neighbors and strangers, to anyone who will hear it. Not because it changes anything, but because I am finally learning what I should have learned at 12 years old, when I broke my mother's vase and chose pride over honesty. But the people who needed my apologies most are gone, or have moved beyond needing them. Helen died 2 years ago, and I never successfully apologized to her for the 35 years of marriage where I chose being right over being close. My children are kind to me now, but we do not have the deep, intimate relationships that require true accountability. We have surface politeness instead of genuine connection. I think about all the moments when a simple, "I'm sorry," could have changed everything. When Helen was crying and I was defending my mistake instead of acknowledging her pain. When my children were disappointed and I was making excuses instead of taking responsibility. 2 words. 2 simple words that could have saved every relationship I destroyed. I'm sorry. That's all it would have taken. Not perfection. Just the basic human decency of acknowledging when I had caused harm. Don't make my mistake. Don't spend your life protecting a pride that isn't worth protecting. Don't choose being right over being loved. Don't wait until you're 93 years old to learn that apologizing is not weakness. It's the foundation of every healthy relationship you will ever have. Learn to say, "I'm sorry." Say it when you make mistakes. Say it when you hurt people. Say it when you are wrong. Say it before it's too late. Before the people who love you stop waiting for you to acknowledge the ways you have failed them. I'm tired now. Tired of carrying decades of unacknowledged mistakes. But I finally learned to say the words that could have saved everything. I'm sorry.